it's interesting that, like, I think one of the things in the last 20 to 30 years, let's say a little longer, since reform and opening up, so since like the 1980s, that has been a backbone of the Chinese economy has been small businesses, right? Like the idea that you can actually open a business, you don't have to work for the state, you have the ability to like start a business, hire people, contribute to the economy. There was an interesting story in the New York Times last week featuring a woman who was like had this kind of dream. Like she grew up incredibly poor, got to the point where she was able to open up like essentially a chain of coffee shops in China, and then borrowed money from the banks to expand, like millions of yuan borrowed from the banks to expand, hired a lot of people, was a pretty large employer, and then COVID just completely, like the Chinese zero COVID policy completely destroyed her business. Like she wasn't able to keep her coffee shops open. She wasn't able to pay people when it came to the end. And then she was actually put in prison for like not being able to pay wages to her employees. And so like her entire business, this business that had hundreds of employees, was completely destroyed. And I wonder how many of those stories are going on in China right now, because like you said, a lot of the stuff that's going on with the stimulus policies, they're going into state-run companies. Like they're not going into like helping small businesses get bank loans, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I read that story, and it was pretty typical. I think it was also just heartbreaking for people like that. And I think that's really, when you talk about like the CCP policies, that's really the problem. Where we're seeing the money go is to defend state-owned enterprise, large businesses, things like that. If you look at the real estate sector, I mean, Evergrande has been bankrupt for basically 2 years. They're technically right now, I don't believe, maybe on some of their international bonds, but domestically, there's basically no ongoing legal process to basically what, as an American, we would think of as they're bankrupt, they're in bankruptcy proceedings, things like that. There's basically just been a pause on everything. Okay. And it's the same thing with Country Garden. They basically, the shareholders voted to basically put a pause on everything. So it's absolutely protecting companies like that and the SOEs and things like that. And the burden is absolutely falling on these private enterprises. And this is one of the things, is that those private enterprises even now are the biggest generators of job growth and innovation and things like that. Just earlier this week, I was reading an IMF paper about basically innovation in the Chinese economy, and what it shows is that young businesses in China within the first year to 3 years are incredibly productive and incredibly innovative and stuff like that, but it falls off quite dramatically as they age and other things like that. And there's a number of reasons for that. But those are absolutely the backbone. But right now, and especially under Xi Jinping, those types of businesses and opportunities are absolutely being stomped out.
Yeah, I was joking. Like when my parents were growing up in China, everybody worked for the state, right? Like you had a work unit, you like worked for the state, whether it was in a factory or whatever you were doing. And now it seems like they're going to go back to that with all the state-owned enterprises having like control of large parts of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I believe me, I would love to disagree, and it's one of those things. I mean, if you look at Xi Jinping, it's like that great saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing. Is it's like, it's not exactly what China was experiencing in the 60s and 70s with a lot of the policies about, those work units and things like that. There's definitely a fair amount of rhyming going.
It seems, and another thing that is impacting the economy now is that it finally seems like a lot of international Western businesses are finally wising up to the scam of the Chinese economy and are pulling out. What impact is that having, and what do you think finally made these enterprises and companies realize now was the time to get out of China?
I think more than anything, it's just an accumulation of things. I don't think it's necessarily one specific thing. Just as a simple example, unless you're a Volkswagen type of company or something like that, and even they are under enormous pressure in different ways. It's just for various reasons. It's just the Chinese market is just very, very difficult. And then you start adding in things like, the data issues, and, you have to hire people, and then, you were shut down for 2 years. All these kinds of issues, education issues. I remember a number when I was starting out over there. A lot of people. China was absolutely seen among the MNC crowd, which they would do 3 years and then go back to the home office, and that was on the fast track to senior executive leadership type path. I don't think that is true of anymore. And even when I was there, that was rapidly falling out of favor. And so the senior, people that were on the fast track to senior leadership, China was no longer really the destination. And now that they've seen like just the returns, the financial pressures, and the other issues, people have said, you know what, we don't need to be doing business as much with China as much. And so you're absolutely seeing companies go elsewhere to get a lot of things done that they need elsewhere. So unless you're really targeting the Chinese market, you go other places to get your trading done.
I think you make a good point that it's not like a specific thing. I've seen a lot of reports about how it's, this anti espionage law, then there's more raids and investigations of Western companies operating in China. But that's been going on forever. Like, didn't we have Peter Humphrey on who, when did he have his thing?
Oh, he was
Oh,
2013, 14, I think.
Yeah. So this raids and investigations, this has been going on for over a decade at least.
And I think it's just gotten. I think it's one of those things where it's just Peter is great, and I think a lot of people just took it as kind of like a one-off, and now it's almost seen as that is standard operating procedure. What you might go through if you're there. The case that gathered a little bit of news attention recently was a company just doing statistical work in China. Not to mention backgrounds and due diligence types reports that anybody that's going to sign a deal is going to want to go through. It's just doing things that you just take for granted now are considered violations of national security. The one I saw recently from a banker was that China was restricting money market rate information as a matter of national security. Okay, this is like almost like CD rates at your bank are now considered national security rates, so that you're not even allowed to publish money market rates in real time.
So how do people or corporations know what kind of expected return to have if you can't even find the rates?
And that's the exact issue, and as to why people are saying, you know what, I don't need this. And I should say, I think there's one other background issue that was is people also just very tangibly, and this is always the way capitalists work. They see just less money to be made. Okay, and so 5-10 years ago, China was probably had interest rates and that were about 4% higher than U.S. interest rates. And so by whether it was just if you just did GDP growth as an investor, or if you just were investing in Chinese government bonds, you were probably doing okay. You were making solid money. Well, now U.S. interest rates are probably almost about 3% higher than Chinese rates. And so people are saying, why do I need the hassle of dealing with China when I can stick my money in a U.S. government bond and earn 3% more than I would earn in China?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party has always, one of its biggest pieces of propaganda is saying that it lifted, hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty. And they didn't. That's not true. It was largely foreign investment in China that helped pump
Well, I
up
mean,
China's economy, and
also you
Chinese
had-
people are
yeah.
being able to do any kind of economic activity themselves.
Small businesses.
Yeah.
Right.
But with this flight of Western capital, what is that going to do to an already struggling Chinese economy?
Well, I think one of the ways to come full circle with all the financial pressures that China has in its banking system, real estate, their economic model, all of those kinds of issues which we discussed earlier, is the only way for them to control those issues is to basically just tighten further. Okay. So, I've kind of jokingly referred to them in the past as a very large, they're basically the province known as Western North Korea. And that is the direction they have to go, because if they loosen in any way, that's simply going to create enormous problems. And I think this fits very well with the great leader's policy. The short version of what I think all indications are that he learned from 1989 when the USSR fell was do the exact opposite. And so he considers 1989 as one of the tragedy of the 20th century. And what the lessons that they've taken from that is no loosening, no relaxation of government controls. And in fact, to prevent that, the government should be even stronger, should be even more in control than ever before. And so that is, I think, the lesson that they've learned. I think that's how they're behaving, and I think that matches very closely with what we can expect in the future.
Rather than learning that communism doesn't work.
Yes.
Well, I mean, so the lesson is that Gorbachev made a mistake, right, in loosening government control over the economy.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's both ideological and an economic necessity for the CCP to tighten controls over everything. Can they just keep tightening controls and sort of, there'll be some problems, but ultimately it's going to sort of hold together?
I think that is what I consider the most likely scenario, in the sense that people have said, well, is there going to be a crisis? I mean, hey, as we've all learned from the past decade, absolutely anything is possible. I don't think you can consider that the most likely scenario. I think the scenario you just described, where they exert more and more control over everything, what is to prevent, for instance, the PBOC from just printing lots of extra money and buying bad loans from the government, or from the banks, and saying, okay, the banks have money to keep lending now. Okay. We're going to exert more and more control over the economy to make sure that there isn't an event. And so I think that what you've described is absolutely what I think is the highest likelihood scenario.